I never thought about, let's niche, let's do, well, no, that's probably not true. I did, but I didn't feel that I could find the right niche. I was still, trying to find my way. And it was only when we got to basements, I was either going to be just a builder. And when the basement thing came along, I said, I felt that was right. You just felt, yeah, we've clicked now, it's the right part of the jigsaw.
Welcome to the Build Smart Blueprint. Today, I am very excited to have Eric onto the podcast. So Eric Morson is the founder and MD of Basement Masters. So Basement Masters is a specialist basement contractor in London. Eric has been running the firm for 20 years. Very, very experienced in the construction space. And also as an owner-operator of a company. Eric prides himself in being very involved in his company, in his operations, making sure, the values and the quality run down throughout the organization. One thing I really love, Eric, and I'm sure we're going to delve into this, is, prioritization of family values in your business as well. Making sure you're delivering for the families that you're, are working for. So welcome to the podcast, Eric.
Thank you, JP. Thanks. That's a lovely introduction from you. I'm happy to give you whatever it is that you require from me.
Listen, I think a lot of our listeners are at quite early stages of their business. And I think it's always nice for somebody that has, gone through the motions and gone through certain economic cycles and all sorts of different transitions that have happened in the construction market. Offline we were just talking about COVID as another one of those. To kind of share the experience, because then you can kind of, in some senses, learn from others' mistakes and not necessarily go and repeat the same things. I'm curious, Eric, if we could start with how Basement Masters kind of came about. Did you start on the tools, or were you kind of in management, or were you even in construction?
JP, it depends how far you want me to go back. I think, you already told me it's about 40 minutes. So we probably ain't got long enough to go right. But I started as a kid doing an apprenticeship, plastering, actually, completely away from that. And that discipline actually taught me a lot of, you learn what's going on in the building. And I was always really ambitious to sort of, well, first of all, try and have my own plastering company, then building company. And you just mentioned about mistakes. Well, if there was any mistakes I haven't made, I don't think they've been invented. I've made a lot of mistakes, and it's really learnt the hard way. But let's move up a little bit, how I actually got into basements. I diversified into basements. From plastering, I was doing what we call structural waterproofing. In actual fact, I had not just plastering, it was a timber and damp company, but I was more erring on the waterproofing side, and the structural waterproofing was always something more akin, something that I was more trying to get into. And I got a little bit of knowledge in it and sort of studied a little bit in that direction. However, there was a engineer friend of mine who we'd done a plastering job for him, actually, and he absolutely loved us because it was a site he was running, and everything was, the block work was wrong, and they had actually to tile the place with specialist tiles that were being made on another country somewhere, blah, blah, a certain size, and block work was terribly out. And in my plastering experience, I learned how what we call plumb and range, which really means you line the wall level, with a stud, and you square it all up, and then you can plaster it all, and you can get
fixing other people's problems.
You can get it all right. It was just bad work that we had to work over.
Yeah.
Anyway, from that, I got to know this engineer really well, and as I sort of started to diversify into, other things, sort of, he came to me one day and said, "Look, I've got a friend," he said, "who's got a basement in Fulham, and they want to lower the floor area, and, all it means is underpin it." I didn't have a clue what underpinning was actually at the time. He said, "Well, I'll show you what to do." He said, "I'll draw it all up." and that was my first exercise in, that's probably the key part of making a basement below an existing property. You know, you've got to take the foundations down lower structurally and support the house. So with a bit of guidance from him, that's where we started. But I absolutely, you know what? That's something I thought, I believe this is great. And it was just coincidental when the business as it was at the time, we were doing an expedition, and I think it was in Alexandra Palace. And next to us was a guy with a stand. It was called a basement information centre. So I got chatted, and yeah, I'd love this, and that's really. I'm now going back to the late '90s, I think, and that's really where I got in and the basement thing built up. But listen, the challenges of learning that and sort of moving forward with that's been quite big. So yeah, it wasn't. I can come on to a lot of the mistakes. Well,
Yeah.
you
Oh,
just yeah.
before we get there, Eric, I want to ask you a little bit about the idea of you always wanting to diversify. Now nowadays it's very common to hear, be a specialist, you can make more money in that way. But back in kind of sounds like 80s, 90s, that wasn't such commonplace knowledge to like, niche. But so I'm curious what was driving you there. Was that because you thought there was more money in it? Did you just like the idea of doing something different? Like what was in you that made you think, okay, I want to kind of diversify. I want to
I wanted to
specialize.
be success. I was mad keen in actually doing something that I really listen. I was always from a very early age. You know, I could tell you a lot about the. I I didn't have a great education. Well, that was my own fault to a degree. Because I was playing truant more often than not, and I came out of school at a very young age. I was still 14 really when I came out of school, and I didn't know what the hell I was going to do. But I've always been ambitious, and I've always worked. You know, one time in my life I had 3 paper rounds. I was trying to fit 2 in the morning and 1 in the evening. You know, it was just trying to um, make a few quid and trying to get on. And the brain level wasn't great. You know, the physical ability to work was great, but I didn't stop think and coordinate and put things properly together properly in life. And like I say, the education was never there. So I never thought about let's niche, let's do well. No, that's probably not true. I did, but I didn't feel that I could find the right niche. I was still trying to find my way, and it was only when we got to basements, I was either going to be just a builder. And when I got, when the basement thing came along, I said, I felt that was right. You just felt, yeah, we've clicked now. It's the right part of the jigsaw.
Yeah, and it's something that actually I think is important to ask you is you mentioned something that is very typical of a lot of owners of construction firms is that academically in school they maybe didn't excel, but they were more kind of usually it's hands-on kinetic kind of learners. How does somebody that as you've just said in your own words, your heads, you weren't that kind of smart, find themselves like, how do they navigate learning about underpinning temporary works, propping structures, a ground table, how do you do that? Because
Listen,
that I'm
it's
sure a lot of people
the
will have
truth
to
is
face,
it's
right?
been a long process, but obviously you start off with just the basics. Like I said, the engineer friend said, look, well, this is how you underpin, you do that, you do this. And let's be honest, how it was designed and how the underpinning went now, I don't remember ever putting any rebars in this. And I think there was a few engineers back in this time and it was, there were different engineers told me, well, the weight, the mass will keep it and that sort of thing. Not that I queried what they'd done, but, they just gave me an explanation as how they saw it. So and at the time, everything would have passed. It was, it'd be went through proper channels, building inspection checks and all that. But this basement thing evolved massively. I think, the bad news was there was quite a few collapsed some way back. Some of the things I learned was just by literally asking questions. it was by probably looking at others, or you just follow up. And a lot of it is you do things. You're working with skilled, educated people, engineers, architects, more the engineers around us. And, I even brought engineers into the company. So naturally, you're going to learn if you've got a desire, I mean, I never knew how to read a drawing going back years. No one taught me. But because I had a desire to try and work out what was going on the drawing, I looked at it. I like to say to some of our lads now, they just, well, some do and some won't. The drawing doesn't mean anything. But then once you realise the importance and what's happening, then you get more involved and more. Although I was a right numbskull, I think I had the ability to sort of learn, and obviously, but one of the expressions I used was I always paddled my own canoe, and in a sense, I didn't work in a firm where they taught you. My father wasn't a builder who could teach me, so I had to find ways, systems, and then you'll see here, you think that makes sense, well, you just automatically start to, but again, it's not from going down a few wrong roads. You jump into things without fully consulting over, is this the right thing to do? You sometimes get the belief. I must say we've been very, very fortunate. We've never made any of the real big mistakes because, I'm not totally risk averse, but, relative, common sense tells you don't do that. It might, it might not work out well.
Yeah.
But it didn't mean that, there's one or two things it's, you have to dig that out again, and we've put that in and blah, blah, blah. And you've learned that should never have gone in that way. So I wish I had, guidance. I wish I had early on a mentor for the business and a mentor, well, for life and for, the way I work. But it's all come and it's all bolted on later. The business now, the stage I brought in a mentor and different things like that. And that's how you develop and make it really work.
Did you I mean, you must have, I don't know what, hundreds of basements been in over this 20
Yes,
years, but
yeah. And listen,
in those early days, yeah.
I would honestly say the involvement with basements now is, well, it depends, ones that we fully constructed and helped design, blah, 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 or ones that we've had involvement with, because at first a lot of the involvement was the structural waterproofing of them, or then it's underpinning. But I honestly think, around me and, my name, there's probably, it's not hundreds, it's probably coming to thousands now, and there are then hundreds of basements since we started.
And have you had, situations, we've all had issues, but have you had like severe situations where you've had kind of a retaining wall collapsing or hit some sort of water main or something like serious?
No,
And I'm curious
well,
more about
yeah.
like
I
if
think
that has happened,
I think
how
quite
did you
honestly,
react to that? How did you kind of manage that?
yeah. I think honestly, to some degree, I think nothing too bad, all of the above. I mean, I remember one job we did, it was 200 square meter basement, external. It was, it was at the back, actually the building was a pub, and we were doing 200 square meters on the back, and then pub had some cellars, which were the levels within it were going to be dropped down. And I remember we dug it out, battered the ground back, or, we thought we'd done enough, and then we put in a big section of RC wall. And, we came in, not exactly like this, but more or less, where we put the RC wall had probably moved about, 15, maybe more than 15 mil, more like 100 mil. It had sort of moved off, the pressure, the ground pressure had moved it. There's a lot of, and, it just didn't, so, imagine that's got to be taken down. And then we realised we had to sheet pile around it and, prop the sheet piles before we could start the work. So, big cost, a big lesson learned. You think everything's okay. Yes, we have. I remember we've actually hit an electric cable. I touch wood. I don't think we've ever hit a water. The electric cable obviously just blew the power in the mains coming in. But the whole design was different to the concept of what we expected. Normally um, we do scan, the ground before we start, but this actually caught us out where the electrics were, and we did. I think I can only remember. I'm wondering if it's happened twice, but I think it's only ever happened once that comes to mind. There's been lots of other little.
So the press, I guess, love, particularly in the basement space in London, love to publish about when things go wrong, and often it's the developer or the main contractor that kind of gets named and shamed. But I think we both know there's usually a whole heap of things behind that, whether that's the design, whether that's a client putting pressure, whether that's a subcontractor. I'm curious, like, because I'm sure you're aware of, if anything goes wrong, it's Basement Masters that's going to be
Yeah,
published
yeah, yeah,
there
yeah,
as the
yeah.
the kind of one at fault. What could you say for other contractors that are aware of this kind of thing, and how do you manage, like, when maybe clients or somebody's pushing you to do something in a way you don't feel comfortable as a firm to do because of the risk, but you also don't want to upset them. Clients always want to keep the costs down. Maybe the designer wants it to look a certain way, but
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
it structurally won't be as confident. I'm curious about how over the years you've kind of learned to deal with
Yeah,
that.
I think you've just got to be honest and open up to the client and say, look, well, that is the risk. That is what's happening. We can. I listen. It works both ways because I've often found myself going to clients and saying, look, or something like this. But other times I've often got an engineer's design and I've thought this is over designed, surely. And I've talked to a client, talked to the engineer, and say, look, couldn't we? And yes, many a time they have. So there's that balance, there's that compromise to be had, and I think experience is the thing, key experience, and then the guys hands on, how experienced they are. And that makes all the difference because you can have one designer be doing one thing and have one crew doing it, and then it'll be a disaster. And if you have another crew doing it, they'll sail through it. They understand what the parameters are to keep it safe and everything else. So, yeah, I don't
Yeah.
think there's too. If I look at anything, I felt, that's just not going to happen. You have to say it. You can't do anything else. And you explain why. And I think most logical people start to understand, and that's it. We can work with it.
I noticed, like, and you said yourself in the 90s, early 2000s, you essentially started off as, I'd say, like a structural waterproofing, structural groundswork contractor, but now you've pretty much Basement Masters is a fully fledged design and build basement contractor. Was that one of the reasons why you, like, the whole risk conversation? Is that why you ended up taking more of the thing,
I
so
must,
you had more control of it?
I must stop you really because you said our whole design and build. Yep, the design aspect now we don't because we don't have the PI. We sort of what it is, the insurances for basements are so extreme. So we've had to sort of cut back and sort of tailor our cloth and then work with engineers or architects who have. We get very much, don't get me wrong, we get very much involved in the design, but we don't actually take the overall. Um, but I think the process is, we now just want to stick with the structural elements, with the groundwork, and, mainly the concrete box, whether and the waterproofing is key because we're well up on the waterproofing elements. So that's our main focus is to stay with that rather than get too far. I personally love the lovely finished basements, and I'd love to go there, but it becomes it's like we try and partner. It becomes like another business altogether, and it gets very difficult to really get all the little finishes and trimmings and then the painting and blah blah blah. For a crew who's just on general fit out work, it's nice and easy. But when you're trying to manage, because we always had them as subcontractors in the elements of doing the main fit out, like the electricians, the plumbers, and so
Yeah.
forth, and the guys. So that was always harder to manage, because they've got their own sort of mindset, and you expect a guy to start here this morning, and you don't even get a call,
Yeah.
and he doesn't turn up till 2 days later, which you can't when you and it's just in most basements, it's not like a big block of flats that's been done, so you can have a crew. So you're using small jobbing guys, and it didn't work. So we work with companies now. We partner with them and let them have
Yeah.
the management and
So,
supervision. And
so if I understood that correctly, the kind of journey of to basement masters when started as specialist works, then kind of started doing the full thing, but now have kind of transitioned back into using trusted partners to do aspects that you don't necessarily want to, and focusing on your core operations. Is that kind of
yeah, I
what's
think
happened?
that more or less spells it out. Yeah, the core operation's still there. It's still basement very much so, but it's the structural core shell and waterproof for basement, and then the fancy lovely basement is normally done through partners rather than ourselves, or the client might want to use their own builder quite often. Yeah, what it is at one time, if you look in our brochure, our current brochure, there's about I'd say 95% of the pictures we were finishing. But, whether we made money on the finishing, if we made a profit on the structural side, we certainly were losing it again on the finishing element. But the aggro and, it sort of, so it made more sense. That's how it evolved into that.
Eric, so I wanted to ask you a little bit about recently you decided to do your own basement. And I thought that was interesting because I don't think as construction business owners, many of us experience what it's like to be on the other side of our own service. So how was that process, and what did you learn from doing that? And is that something you recommend for others to kind of try to do if they can?
Yeah, I learned it could be a game for fools. No, no, that's sort of exaggerating. Well, I'll be honest. Let's start at the beginning. The reason why I done it was because I did always want to have my own basement, and it was an embarrassment when, you know, not so much an embarrassment, but I wish I could have said yes when clients asked me, "Do you have your own basement?" So, I could have done it underneath my current house, but the footprint was relatively large, solid concrete floors, and I just, the disruption would have been huge. Um, and we have a very large garden at the back of our house. And it was just an opportunity that, we wanted more space. We didn't have to. I think actually in the area I live, I think planning is, it can be really weird. And I don't think I've got much of an extension on the back of the house with the basement. What did seem more feasible was to be able to put uh, through through permitted development, sorry, we were able to put a fairly good sized ground floor area in at the back, and that wasn't a problem. I did actually apply for planning in the first instance, knowing that I'm likely to be rejected. The whole lot together, the whole lot as a package. So I have the basement and the ground floor, right? And I went, no, they refused it. However, then I reapplied through permitted development to actually put the ground floor area in, which is, I think we're probably looking at, over, I've forgotten now, it's about 60 square meters. Um, and then applied through planning to put the basement in below, and that's yet again even a little larger, and that sailed through no problem because once we had it, my argument was, what can you see? You've got the stuff above. No, it's not really affecting anybody, and yeah, they allowed it. Well, I kind of learned, I mean, I must be honest. Obviously, I did the a bit of a scrap paper costs. How much is this thing going to cost me? Blah blah blah. I started a little bit just before COVID, and I should be very good at working out how many cubic meters of muck you're going to take out and that sort of thing. And I must have got it wrong somewhere in my calculation. It ended up a good bit, and the whole lot. There was with COVID and after COVID, and the amount of the cost of materials and everything else. It caught me out a little bit, cost wise. So yeah, but you're there, you're doing it, so you stick with it. There's an awful lot of what is it in the process? What I got to do also, I had to privatize. Sorry, not privatize. I had to prioritize is the word I'm looking for. I had to prioritize the business. So I didn't give myself, I'll have a crew down there day in, we'll knock it all out. It was a bit of a holiday job to some degree, which was really annoying because, like I say, it's a big garden. We had to get the muck out, and there's an awful lot of muck to go to the front of your garden. So you've got piles of muck in the front of the garden for a grab lorry to come and get. And, we had very, very, as we're having all the time now, wet weather. And, it's trudging it into the house, and these sort of things were going on. And really, so, I mean, if it was a client, I don't think they'd want to put up with it. And I'd have to be very careful of how I plan it, to completely, keep it as clean, tidy, neat. And we do that. But probably because it was me and I just wanted to get it done, it was that end of it wasn't quite as probably as tip top as it could have been.
As it could have been. Yeah.
Yeah, and you know what? It always goes on a little bit longer than what you plan as well. So there's that sort of, and I've got to keep my other half happy because they just say it. She wasn't as keen to do the
Yeah,
job
of
as I
course.
was. So yeah, but all
And
in all,
would you say that there was anything that you implemented differently in the way, you guys as a firm communicate with your clients after experiencing yourself? Or do you think because, you didn't necessarily give yourself the service that your clients get, there wasn't that much to implement?
I I'd say there wasn't that much because I think we've always been focused on being, client considerate. You kind of it's not only the client. We've got to think of, especially with us, we've got to think of neighbours. You've got to think of, it can be a little disruptive for neighbours. But the truth is, we've had scenarios where neighbours have said, you know what, I didn't think it was going to as bad as I thought it was going to be. So
Yeah.
you've got to really
Yeah.
work hard to sort of get everybody on board and realise, it's not the nightmare that some
I
people.
want to, can I dig into that a little bit more, Eric? Because um, this idea of like uh, building trust with clients and neighbors and stuff, because obviously now, you're an established company. It's not just you, it's not just Eric, the plasterer, that's now doing basements. Everybody knows you as the basement contractor with the full setup. But back in those early days, like, how were you convincing these homeowners? And often someone considering a basement is probably, a well-to-do lawyer or whatever, that you're the guy to do their job. They can trust, the foundations of their house to be dug out by you and your crew. Like, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Well, it's a good thing you asked because in those days, the well-to-do lawyer, listen, I used to get the inquiry, go to the sales, but my conversion rate would have been really, really low. I think in those days, the market um, a family was not necessarily in, the, SW sort of postcodes, where the properties are worth a couple of mil or whatever. Um, they were sort of bordering on, where people worked out, let's put a basement in. And I started, I must admit, I started very raw in a sense because, I had to try and budget to people rather than budget. The relationship had to be, I was doing a job where people didn't have deep, deep pockets, and we were trying to do a job and make a profit. So that was the early days, and it was a real steady build. And I think it would be fair to say that I used to knock on doors early on, especially some of the better well-to-do properties. There's two sides to this actually, because I'd be on the phone, I'd talk to people, make the appointment, and I'll be honest with you, early days, I used to knock on the door, and you could see the surprise on people's faces, because they didn't think I was the guy they were speaking to. Obviously, they didn't know it was a black man, or they didn't, and it's just, and I often also used to have a feel of, oh, let's get rid of him, sort of thing. And well, it was more of a challenge, and I had to work hard to demonstrate my knowledge, my ability, and our keenness, and this sort of thing. And I think, gradually it evolved. It didn't happen overnight. It just, we got to a point where, the conversion rates are sort of better. You're not running after everything and thinking, you're getting, now we've got a real, I go and see somebody. Obviously, you've got a little bit of marketing tool, you've got a brochure or something. But in those days, I didn't have anything. And yeah, it wasn't the easiest
So
thing.
when Eric, when you get into the kind of, because you mentioned there, in the early days, it was important to kind of add value by your sort of price being competitive, or lower than maybe some of the other providers they're looking at. How were you approaching that when you're doing something, when you're dealing with groundworks and you're not necessarily knowing what you're going to face? Are you doing like cost plus? Are you maybe allowing the client to do materials? So, like, because obviously, as you said, you still need to make a profit. So I'm curious how you navigated that.
Yeah. Well, it varied. And let's be honest with you, there's times when the profit wasn't really there. It wasn't there often enough. I think there was a variety of ways, and it obviously depended on what sort of client we were working with. Like you say, the cost plus, that might have come in a little, not very much. I can sort of think back. There was, most of it would have been fixed. Maybe we had terms and conditions that, if we found X, Y, or Z, it was going to be an extra, and that sort of, because it was a case of, you could say to the client, well, it could be this. We know that's a definite starting point, but it could be this, rather than, they wouldn't buy in if I said, and then hopefully we try and bring it in as close as we can for them. So, look, let's be honest, it's just a case of, I've always grafted and worked hard. You have to work, sometimes maybe, when I was sort of more or less on tools myself, as well as you're probably doing the hours to get the same amount of bucks as the guy, next door. You're probably doing a good few, you're doing another 30% or something, but you had to work hard to make it. It was just, it is tough. There's no easy, if you're determined you want to get somewhere, you just keep bashing away, don't you?
Yeah. So were you in those early days, you were kind of doing the work yourself as well? You weren't just managing the jobs, but you were actually, in the ground digging.
Very early days. Yeah, I'm talking very early days. I'm still, I mean, when I had the plastering and the, and the timber and damp and all that sort of thing, I was more or less, we started on the tools, eased away, came off the tools. But as I was going, there was times in my life when I had to pick up a shovel, going back sort of 20, 25 years even. Certainly not now, because I'd be just a wasted shovel. I'd rather give it to someone else. But yeah, that's how it was.
I want to ask you, Eric, about something you mentioned earlier, and my so my father was in the London construction market, groundworks as well, actually, in the kind of 70s, 80s. And, from speaking to him, it was a very different time in
Yeah,
terms
yeah,
of people of color working in the construction industry, and especially when you're kind of at the management level, or you're kind
yeah,
of
yeah,
telling
yeah, yeah,
people
yeah,
what to do. Um, I- I'm curious, like, what your experiences of it were in starting your basement firm, because I think there's also an element in some senses of, like, even now there's a lot of plasterers that are black.
yeah,
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 there are a lot of, like, certain minorities do
yeah,
certain
yeah,
trades,
yeah,
but you
yeah,
kind of went into something, and it's rare anyway. Even because I
yeah,
speak
yeah,
to a lot of construction company owners, to be talking to one that is black, and that's in your age bracket as well. Because
yeah,
now this is a little bit
yeah,
different.
yeah.
So, what were your experiences of it? And I'd really love if you could talk to perhaps others that are in that same situation, because I've actually talked to some of my clients that had exactly the same thing. The client opens the door and they don't expect to see what they
Yeah,
see.
yeah, 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 yeah,
And, I'd love for you to give some,
yeah, 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 yeah.
advice and things that you've
Listen,
picked up over those times.
yeah. Look, I always, there's one story I always tell, because we know how people's perception and racial and cultural differences are. And, some people work differently with it. And quite often I find that people have got a mindset, well, he's not going to know nothing. And there's one story I like to tell, though, and I remember knocking on a woman's house, a black woman doing the job. This was actually just before basements now. This was the early roundabout when I started. But the job we were knocking for wasn't basements. I remember knocking there, and she said, "Oh, I don't normally deal with black men." And she's a black woman herself. And yeah, I said, well, yeah, I said, well, why not? What's the matter? She said, well, I've had so many letdowns of this and that and blah, 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 or whatever the excuses were. So I had to sell to her, and I really had to sell hard to try and, get her to deal with us. Anyway, this then involves we going back to, when the Labour government came in. I remember being
Hmm.
asked to go to some, I can't remember, it was sort of a seminar meeting type thing, because the Labour government had organised this um, meeting, and it was mainly all black players. There was one, the chair of the meeting was a white guy, and it was about really what the Labour government could do to make it better for black businesses and black people to work and sort of whatever. And why they chose me, I don't know. And I remember telling them this story, and I had to add to it as well, because I'd just read the book, Nelson Mandela's book, Long Walk to Freedom. And somewhere in that book is this story where Nelson he's out of jail, he's away from Robben Island, and I think it must have had him in a holding camp, and they were going to fly him to Pretoria or something like that. And remember, he'd been in prison 30 years. He's in the plane, and he looks up in the plane, and he sees the pilot is a black man. And he says even he doubted it, because the psychology of it all, can a black man fly a plane? And he'd been championing the cause for black people for years. But he found himself there, because, psychologically, we're all driven into this. It's there. It's something built into our and psyche, it's not just in the white man, it's in the black man that, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of black, big, proud people, but the Nelson Mandela case just shows you how hard these things are. It's already there, grounded there. So it only happens that when I started, as the basement element built, and I sort of got this open, closed door, type of attitude, you do have to fight it. But most people at the back of it, they realize that, if you're genuine, you're true, you're skilled, you're going to do what you say you're going to do, you've got to, it will come through. And early on also, you're not always valuing anything on the price. You've always been trying to be competitive, or overly competitive is probably a better way of putting it, to actually get in there. So it's still part of that build. It's always going to be there. I can't say, I can't say I've had anybody sort of who's been, I don't think, been overly rude, racist, or anything to me as far as, the business is concerned. I've had several things in the past, outside of, certainly I've had it. I remember I've had it on the plastering field. I've been on, when I was plastering one time on a site where I really got on. It's actually quite a long story. It happened in Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, and that I'm going back now into the, I'm going back into the 80s, probably early mid 80s, and in the canteen, I really got on very well with practically everybody, and I think that came up because Bob Marley was playing I was a big Bob Marley fan and something blah blah, and I mentioned it, and this guy, there was two brothers who were pretty hostile type of characters, and he said, "Oh, what you're lot, blah blah blah." Right? He said, "I hated Brixton, or he's not even from this world." He just literally started nothing. I couldn't tell you half the things that he just completely sort of came out of the blue. He obviously didn't like the fact I was there, and the saddest part about that was because I got on very well with the guys generally, but nobody said, "Oh, I'd stop." I don't remember anyone really giving it, back to. I tried to sort of put up my argument, but I felt very demoralised at the fact that I didn't get that support. So, but no, I think now we've got to appreciate. I'd say to anybody, you've got to appreciate. It isn't necessarily a very level playing field, but it's a lot better than it ever was. So let's, take that. And I think if we keep fighting and working hard, it's, we can only make the best out of, what you've been given, really. That's the thing, isn't it?
Yeah, and I know you mentioned towards some point in your business journey you brought on a mentor to help with your
Yeah.
business, and this question doesn't necessarily relate to your experiences of being a black man in the construction industry, but how did that transition? Like, it sounded like there was some shifts and was some things that happened, but what can you talk a little bit about, like the differences of you having like somebody in your external sphere to like now help you with guiding you on business, and you said life as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, I more or less said life, but no, I haven't. Well, I haven't specifically, not that I can say I had anyone in to help me for life. I think that was me sort of speaking very sort of loosely. The business side of
Yeah.
mentoring. No, listen. It's only me going and approaching. It's not the first sort of time I've had business breakfast clubs, all these things that one does to try and bring in business and grow the business. And I mean, I joined the business breakfast club for um, goodness, it must have been 4 or 5 years, and I never got a single job out of it. But actually, that wasn't the point of being there, because it wasn't like the place where I was going to get basements, but it was. It taught me a lot about business and the management and how you know how you can fall back and use other services. But when I actually bought that didn't really disrupt or change anything. I just think we were practically at this time on the right road, but there were just too many things. I found what I wanted to do, and to actually achieve it, I wasn't able to manage it, because there was just always too many things, too many balls being juggled, and it's just somebody that's ultimately they say, right, here, take your time, let's look at this, and let's work out your KPIs, let's do this, and that guidance started. And in actual fact, it actually took me a long way towards really learning how to run a business. I could run the business from a structural construction, talk to clients and all this, but to actually work out, the figures, because, at the end of the day, when you're in business, that's key, isn't it? Your figures, and and if you're not on top of them, ultimately you're not on top of your business. So that's the key bit. That's why a mentor came on board, and it's no harm. It's been quite useful, been very useful,
Yeah,
really.
it's a really key stage, I think, when how I like to kind of look at it or call it is from moving from being an operator to an owner, and that
Yeah,
transition, because you're right, you're dead right that typically, especially if you've built your business from one project to doing two projects at once to doing 10 projects at once,
yeah,
you
yeah,
just
yeah,
become a really good project manager.
yeah,
But
yeah,
actually,
yeah.
to then look at the business operations can sometimes be a bit of a different ball game. So, Eric, one of the reasons that when I spoke to you and kind of convinced you to come on this podcast was because you said you were keen to share your experiences and knowledge, and give something back to the community of entrepreneurs that are maybe earlier on in their journey. I think you really have delivered on this. I think you've given some really good insights and talking points and discussions. For anybody that does want to, that listens to hear what you're saying and really resonates and maybe wants to communicate with you further, is there an avenue that they can kind of reach you that you would be happy to kind of speak to them on?
Yeah, I certainly have an email address. We have an email address. It's Eric at basementmasters.co.uk. And if anybody goes, signs into that, I'll be only too pleased to try and help where I can.
We'll drop a link to Basement Masters, of course, and also your email address that you've been very kind to share there.
Okay.
And yeah, thanks again. Take
Right.
care.
My pleasure. Okay. Thanks. Anytime. Listen, all the best.
Thanks, Eric.